You all, this has been a long time coming. I literally took a year off. Last year was doing its big one. That's all I can kind of say. A lot of things happened. I was studying for the bar, um, a few other things. And so, life just got away from me and I had to take a pause on the podcast. Definitely still missed recording. I missed the stories. I definitely have hundreds of stories for you all. Not really hundreds, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of stories for you all, and I'm ready to get back to it. So, welcome back. This is season 3. I mean, season 2 was kind of short, but we got some stuff out. Like I said, we took a year off, and now we are in season 3 of cognitive capacity. And I think we should start from the beginning in this conversation about the connection between cognitive capacity and youth justice and adult cases and being tried as adults, all those good things. So what I decided to do in the first episode of season 3 was to go back, and I want to go back way back to 2 precedent cases that help shape the catalyst of juvenile law and justice and its separation from adult criminal law in the proceedings, the process, how it works, what rights are available, all of those type of things. So this is going to be a 2-part episode 1, season 3 situation. So, rock with me, bear with me as we do this. So the first one, the cases that I'm going to talk about, the first 2 cases, part 1 and part 2, I'm going to talk about Gerald Galt, which was the subject in the Supreme Court precedent Henry Galt case, and we're going to unpack that case, part 2. However, before Henry Galt, there was another case that's really important, and I think that we need to unpack to set the groundwork and the guidelines to kind of understand everything else as we move forward in season 3 and future seasons coming up. And that one is what today's episode is about. It is part 1. It is about Morris Kent. And Morris Kent was a subject in the Supreme Court landmark case, Kent v. United States. In the Kent v. United States case, this case led to a major shift in juvenile justice around what rights a youth has and what things are entitled to a youth, even though it may not be an adult case. And so that's where we're going to start. We're going to start there. So bear with me as I unpack each case and discuss cognitive capacity as we dialogue. All right, so here we go. I want to start off by saying, rock with me for a second, because the Kent v. U.S. case is a very busy case. It has a few turns before we reach the catalyst of why this case is so important to cognitive capacity and to youth justice and to everything that we're going to talk about. And so I want to just kind of start with who Morris Kent was. So first and foremost, Morris Kent was a 16-year-old Black male who lived in Washington, D.C. Okay, he lived with his mommy, who was a single parent. The research that I've done, the history says that the mom and the dad had divorced when Morris Kent was about 2 years of age. There isn't much documentation on whether or not the dad was still actively in Morris's life, but we know that his mom raised him primarily on her own. In addition, Morris Kent attended DC public schools, and there are teacher reports around a history of difficulties with academic success, his behavior, and his progress in the academic space. So it's really important that we keep those things in mind as I'm talking. Okay, so the Morris Kent case was very vital in setting the precedence that youth are entitled to due process rights. At the time, the courts ruled that youth are entitled to notice of their charges, legal counsel, and a fair hearing. Prior to this, and even in this matter that we're talking about, youth generally having these rights was a hit or miss. It wasn't clear cut. It wasn't necessarily required. It wasn't always discussed that youth were entitled to being aware of their charges, that their counsel be aware of their charges, that they were entitled to legal counsel, and that they have a fair hearing just like adults when they have cases. So, um, Morris uh, starts the conversation and sets the precedent for these things changing. So the first thing I want you to remember is that this is happening in the 1960s. This case hit a head around 1966. And so during this time, Black people are fresh off the civil rights battle. Okay. We are still in the thick of changes, people getting used to the civil rights, people still pushing back on civil rights. So that also means that in that capacity, Black youth are still in a lot of vessels being railroaded or pushed to the side or ignored, or, some people are not, a lot of people are not happy that these civil rights are being enforced. And so this is a very precarious time in history in the United States. So the other thing that I want you to remember is that, like I said, Morris Kent lived in Washington, D.C. And this is important to remember because Washington, D.C. is not a state. It wasn't a state back in the 60s, and it's still not a state. And so what that means is that DC generally does not have state laws. They follow federal laws and federal expectations. They don't have prisons in Washington, DC because there are no state prisons in DC because DC is not a state. And so most times when things happen, or if an individual is charged as an adult, they are usually shipped out of Virginia and further because there are no state prisons in DC because of that. And so again, keep in mind that, there are no there are no state laws. And, there kind of is most of the time jurisdiction expectations between what I'm going to say and talk about, understanding that when I say district court and federal courts, that this is because DC is not a state. So we don't have state courts in Washington, DC. So at 16, Morris Kent was arrested. This wasn't his first time being arrested, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But he was arrested and alleged to be connected to charges of breaking into a house. 3 counts of breaking into a house. He was charged with 3 counts of robbery and charged with 2 counts of rape. Now, mind you, like I said, this wasn't his first time being arrested. He was already on probation for a prior offense that happened in 1959 when he was 14 years of age. So at the time that he gets arrested for this case, it's about 1961. And he has a lengthy history already for similar charges. In 1959, at the age of 14, he was already on probation for housebreaking and purse snatching. Now, again, keep in mind that there is no history of him ever raping anyone in the prior cases. This is just something that has come up in this case. So being that Kent was 14 on probation and 16 when he was alleged to have committed these charges, he was considered a juvenile at the time of his arrest. And so what happens when you are a juvenile at 16 and you have committed crimes such as robbery and rape, you tend to be between 2 decisions. The decision to either keep the case in juvenile court or waive the case to adult court. And so at that time, Morris Kent was between 2 decisions of exclusive jurisdiction of DC juvenile court or juvenile court waiving their jurisdiction to US district court and trying him as an adult. So I'm using a lot of legal terms, and what I'm doing moving forward as I'm having these podcast recordings with you all is that I will start to unpack a little bit of the legal terminology and things like that so you can better understand it if you're not on the legal side. So when we talk about jurisdictions, jurisdiction pretty much just means who has ruling or decision over that individual or the case or the situation. And so in this matter, because he was technically a juvenile, automatically juvenile court has the jurisdiction to make a decision. But juvenile court also has the opportunity to decide that they want to waive their jurisdiction and allow the adult courts to make a decision and try the case. And so that's where he was at the time. However, keep in mind that in order for a juvenile court to waive their jurisdiction, they have to do a full investigation before they can waive the jurisdiction. Has to be a total, apparent full investigation. Now, again, tapping a little bit into the legal side, at this time in 1961, when the case was going on, and even kind of now, there was no clear-cut explanation of what full investigation meant. There wasn't a step 1, you have to do this, step 2, you have to do that, step 3, you have to exhaust all of these things. It just said full investigation, which leaves the subjective opening of what you decide a full investigation includes. And so because of that, that he's kind of in a limbo. So he gets a counsel, okay, and his counsel is going to do some things, and we're going to unpack that in a second. But ultimately, the juvenile court ignores Kent's counsel's motion for all of the records and a review of the motion to waive, and they decided not to rule on his attorney's motion and instead entered an order to waive their jurisdiction. So now he's not in limbo. The juvenile court has decided they're waiving their jurisdiction and that the U.S. District Court in D.C. could do what they want with Kent. So U.S. District Court in D.C. automatically picks it up, and Kent wasn't indicted as an adult at the age of 16. So this is where we start to unpack and recognize the cognitive capacity parts, because now we're talking about a 16-year-old that at this time is being tried as an adult and likely will be in facilities that house adults, even though the mental capacity, the maturity, and even the physical makeup may be vastly different. Okay, so when his counsel finds out that the district court in DC is indicting him as an adult at the age of 16, they move to dismiss the indictment, and they argue that the juvenile court's waiver of their jurisdiction was invalid. Why did they say that it was invalid? His attorney is arguing that they did not do a full and thorough investigation before they waived their jurisdiction. Either way, district court in DC overrules the motion and they move forward with trying him as an adult. Now, in that capacity, Morris Kent ends up being convicted on 6 counts of housebreaking. Excuse me, he was convicted on 6 counts, 3 counts of housebreaking and 3 counts of robbery. He was acquitted on the 2 counts of rape by reason of insanity. So I want to stop there, and I want to unpack how we got to these connections, convictions, and acquittals, okay? So now I'm going to go back again. So again, like I said, it's a very busy case. I want you to rock with me, right? Just, if you need to stop and replay that last part, go ahead and do that, and then come back to this part. Okay, so here's the facts associated with the charges. On September 21st, 1961, an intruder entered the apartment of a woman in Washington, D.C. and raped her. The fingerprints that they found on the scene were picked up, analyzed, and apparently were later matched to Morris Kent. Okay. At the time, Morris Kent, like I told you, was already on probation for housebreaking. So they had his fingerprints in the system. So when they ran the fingerprints, there was a match. So the police go to pick Morris Kent up. Okay. So remember I said, this is going on, on September 2nd, 1961. On September 5th, 1961, the police pick Morris Kent up and they place him into custody. Being placed into custody means you are arrested. When you are arrested, you are supposed to be read your Miranda rights. Keep that in mind. Just put a pin in that part, okay? They arrest him, they take him to the police station, and they proceed to interrogate him for 7 hours. This is a 16-year-old boy Remember I told you the school systems have reported, DCPS school system, the teachers have reported that he's had difficulty with academic success, behavior, being able to succeed in the classrooms. So we're talking about 16, already some possibilities of some learning difficulties and things going on. And he's now been interrogated for 7 hours, okay? It was a tense 7 hours, apparently. And in those tense 7 hours, he eventually confessed to being involved. Again, put another pin in that. We're going to unpack it. Don't worry. There is no known documentation of whether or not his mother was ever made aware that they had picked him up, arrested him, and taken him down to the police station to interrogate him for 7 hours. There also is no documentation or history of him ever being Mirandized. So when they arrested him, they didn't read him his rights. And apparently, when they were interrogating him for 7 hours, they didn't read him his rights. There's no documentation of that. So after being interrogated for the 7 hours, he confessed to being involved. What that means, I'm not sure. It could mean that there were other people involved, or it could mean what? I have no idea. But eventually his mother finds out that he's in police custody and that he is being interrogated. So she gets a lawyer. In the process of her getting a lawyer, he has confessed, and now the cops take him to receiving home for children. This is at 10 p.m. So if he was interrogated for 7 hours, that means they picked him up at around 3 p.m. on September 5th, 1961. By 10 p.m., they were taking him to the home for the receiving home for children. Okay. He gets there at 10 p.m. Bright and early the next morning. The receiving home for children again releases him back into the custody of the cops for further interrogation. The cops take him from the receiving home for children early in the morning, and they interrogate him again for another grueling length of hours until about 5 p.m. that day. This is on September 6th, 1961. So he's been interrogated twice in intense hours. Again, we don't know if he was Mirandized. Again, he was released into law enforcement custodies without his parent present, without an attorney present. Nobody's present. It's just him and cops. Twice. Intense hours. He confesses. Okay? So his mother, like I said, was getting an attorney. So once his mommy gets the attorney, his mother and the attorney sets up an interview with the social service director of the juvenile courts. And the purpose of this interview was to prepare to represent any decisions about waivers that the juvenile court would have about his jurisdiction. So the attorney was already predicting that if they're interrogating him like this, there's no telling what he said, but we have knowledge of mental concerns already. And we need to prepare that if they try to waive, we're going to push it back. The other thing is, apparently, the director of social services at juvenile court had made it known to Morris Kent's mommy and the attorney that it was very likely that the juvenile court was going to waive their jurisdiction, and that there was no likelihood that they were going to allow them to hear their argument, that their decision was already pretty much set. They were waiving it to adult court. So in court, what happens when there is a waiver in question for a child is that there is a code that comes into play. And so I'm going to read to you the code, but it is 11 DC Code Section 1553. And what the code says is, when a child 16 years of age or over is charged with an offense, which if committed by a person 18 years of age or older is a felony, or when a child under 18 years of age is charged with an offense, which if committed by a person 18 years of age or over is punishable by death or life imprisonment, a judge may, after full investigation, waive jurisdiction and order the child held for trial under the regular procedure of the court, which would have jurisdiction of the offense if committed by a person 18 years of age or older, over. Or the other court may exercise the powers conferred upon the juvenile court by this chapter and subchapter 1 of chapter. Title 16 in conducting and disposing of such cases. So ultimately, what it is saying is that if a youth 16 years of age or older is charged with an offense that likely, if you were an adult, would be a felony, then the juvenile courts has the right to, after a full investigation, waive their jurisdiction and allow that youth to be tried as an adult, just like any other adult would be tried as an adult. Pretty much thinking that the alleged crime is so severe and so serious that if you were an adult, you would never have a chance to be seen as a misdemeanor or seen in a juvenile court. And so if a 16-year-old or older commits the same type of alleged crime, then the juvenile court has the ability to decide that they should be tried as an adult and waive their rights. But a full investigation must be done first. So, the juvenile courts in DC during this case decides to rest their hat on that DC code section 1553 and decides to waive their right. It's important to note that after this interview, it doesn't look good for Morris Kent. One of the biggest things is that, reviewing the case and things, it was alleged that the social services director of juvenile court was pessimistic and he spoke of a review not being likely. He didn't give them an easy time as far as getting the motion that Kent's attorney was filing to the judge to help make the decision. And so either way, Kent's counsel filed the motion. In that motion, he included a psychiatric evaluation about Morris Kent's mental condition. Despite this, you already know that the case was waived to adult courts. In addition, it's reported that the school's principal also provided an affidavit that it was apparent, this is quote unquote, apparent to the school officials that Morris Kent presented with, quote, serious behavior problems and needed psychological help. In that affidavit from the school's principals, they argued that they were not interviewed by the juvenile court about Morris Kent's difficulties. They also report that his mother submitted an affidavit to the juvenile court that the juvenile court only interviewed her about Morris Kent's arrest, and they did not give her the opportunity to speak about her concerns related to his mental condition, his deficiencies that she observed, and the fact that he had abnormal conduct over the years that had never been addressed or discussed. Further, the psych report stated that they found Morris Kent to be, quote, a victim of severe psychopathology, and that a complete and thorough investigation, including social factors, was necessary. Okay, so when we talk about cognitive capacity, I mention this all the time to you all, how those social factors are really important to the mitigating part of a case with youth and adults. And so again, putting that legal hat on, you have mitigating factors and aggravating factors. The mitigating factors are the factors that talk about things in that individual's life, situations, experiences that may have contributed to or led up to the alleged charges that the person is facing. The aggravating factors are those factors of the actual committance of the alleged crime, right? So social factors include things like your relationships, your personal relationships, your romantic relationships, your platonic relationships, your familial dynamics, your cultural background, any work that you've done. And for us, as we're talking about cognitive capacity, a very important part of social factors is your school performance. That includes everything from your attendance, your grades, if you've ever had special education, your disciplinary record. All of those things are key things that are included in the social factors that the clinicians take into account, i.e. the psychiatrists and the psychologists, that the attorneys take into account, that should be taken into account by the juvenile court when they're making a decision to waive, whether or not to waive to adult court or not. Further, a person's substance abuse, their social networks, their significant influence of mental health, all of those things are really important. That mental health and that school performance and your social networks are very key to deciding if you have the cognitive capacity to be tried as an adult. If you had the cognitive capacity during the time of the alleged crime to be held to the standard that an adult would be held for those type of things. And so in Morris Kent's counsel's affidavit, he focused on some key things. And so his counsel focused on the interview that Morris Kent had. I'm sorry if I keep saying David. I'm not sure why I'm saying David, but Morris Kent. The interview that Morris Kent had, the discussion or interaction that the mother, the counsel, and Morris Kent had with the social service director. He talked about the psychiatric report that was submitted prior to the waiver. He also argued that, Morris Kent had been significantly interrogated by the police after his arrest and prior to the waiver, and that they had filed a written objection to this interrogation, which they didn't receive any response from, even though, there was some concerns with that interrogation that we're going to get into. In addition, Morris Kent's attorney argued that he had also filed a motion with the juvenile court asking that Morris Kent be hospitalized, that his social service file be disclosed to the attorney. So in that capacity, what he's saying is that he hasn't even had access to Morris Kent's social service file, even though he's Morris Kent's attorney. The juvenile court would not release the social service file to him. He also argued that a hearing be held prior to any decision to waive. So he's saying, like, we didn't get a chance to present anything. We didn't get a chance to talk about anything. I'm technically functioning from a place of deficit because I haven't seen all of the records, and you've already made a decision to waive. This is a problem. In the vessel of these requests, the attorney said that he represented to the court that he could not provide effective assistance as counsel to Morris Kent without being able to submit the social record service records to the appropriate experts available to him for study by such experts. So again, like I said, those social factors and the social records are important. And so his attorney was arguing that, I can't do my job as the attorney, which again, at this current time in this current year, is a violation of a person's rights to not have effective counsel. But back then, in 1961, it wasn't that big a deal. And in this case of juveniles, it wasn't even considered that you not having the social files would be considered ineffective counsel. But his attorney was very on it and very smart. And so he argued, my counsel, it at the very minimum is ineffective because I don't have all of everything I need to argue or fight, but you all have everything. So I'm working up against a deficit at this point. And so it's important to note that the judge had access to the records from the juvenile court staff, the social service files, the reports, all of the reports from the psychologist, especially one of the reports that was filed on September 8th, 1961, that referred to Kent's mental condition. In that report, the psychologist reported that Morris Kent had rapid deterioration of his personality structure and possibility of mental illness. But those reports were not given to Kent's counsel, which again, like I said, now is a clear violation. Back then it was not yet, but stay tuned. So now we're back to the case being in adult court. We've unpacked how we got to adult court, what factors were included with the adult court. Now we're back in adult court, okay? And so in adult court, Kent's lawyer was focused on arguing that Morris Kent wasn't criminally responsible secondary to, one, his unlawful act being the product of a mental disease or defect. And again, it was argued that it was the product of a mental disease or defect because, remember, you have these psychological or psychiatric reports that is reporting that he has a mental condition that is impacting his personality structure in the presence of a possibility of a mental illness, okay? And so where Morris Kent's attorney is arguing is he's arguing from a case, a precedent case, which is Durham v. U.S. And in Durham v. U.S., the case primarily focuses on what happens when a defendant is not guilty by reason of insanity. Okay, and so ultimately, Morris Kent's attorney is arguing that Morris Kent can't be held criminally responsible as an adult at the age of 16 because he has a mental disease or defect. So there are different types of insanity pleas, and one of those insanity pleas is the Durham plea. Okay, and so it's known as the Durham rule, and what it ultimately is what we call in the legal space a defense. And so the Durham defense or Durham rule is ultimately a rule in criminal cases by which a jury can determine if a defendant is not guilty by reason of insanity because the criminal act was the product of a mental disease. So there's clear elements that have to be met in order for it to be considered a mental disease. But ultimately, what it ultimately does is argue that the person doesn't have the ability to use their judgment in determining whether their criminal actions were the product of a mental disease, whether or not their actions are criminal because of the presence of a mental disease. And so that's where the Durham Act comes from. Now, it's important to note that eventually the Durham Act is abandoned in 1972. But at that time, the Durham Act was in place because it was a precedent in 1954. So at the time of Morris Kent's case in 1961, it was a valid argument from his counsel to argue the insanity plea under the Durham Act. Okay, so let me tap into my legal hat real quick to discuss the elements of these charges, about what must be proven and what must be met in the elements of a defense insanity when we're talking about a robbery that happens in 1961 in Washington, D.C. Okay, so in D.C., we're going to start with robbery. Robbery is defined whereby force or violence, whoever inflicts it, whether against resistance or by sudden or stealthy seizure or snatching, or by placing fear, shall take from the person or immediate actual possession of another anything of value is guilty of robbery. Okay, so the elements of robbery is force or violence, resistance, seizure or snatching, or fear. Those are the actions that has to happen. The next element is taking of an immediate or actual possession. And so something has to be taken. It has to be something removed from somebody else. Okay. The next element is anything of value. And so with those elements, if those elements are met, all three have to be met, then a person can be convicted of robbery or be found guilty of robbery. So in this case, when we're talking about Morris Kent at 16 being charged with 3 counts of robbery, we're looking at whether he did something by force or violence, whether there was resistance or sudden or stealthy seizure or snatching, or whether there was fear, and then if something was taken from a person or something was possessed immediately that was of value. Okay, so going back to the case, remember September 2nd, 1961, somebody entered this woman's home in Washington, D.C. And during that time, the woman was raped. There also is reports that a wallet was taken. So when we're talking about by force, where the element of by force could be argued that because there was rape, meaning that there was an action of force or resistance from this individual, and in the commission of that happening, something was taken, the wallet being the thing that was taken, then the person met the element. They could also be arguing that because this was an intruder into this woman's apartment, the woman could have been in fear, and being in fear is an element. And then while they were in fear, the wallet was taken, the element of fear and an actual taking of something from that person, being the wallet that was of value, would meet the elements for robbery. Okay, so let's now talk about the elements of rape in DC. The element of rape is the definition of rape in DC is whoever engages in a sexual act or sexual conduct with another person and should have knowledge or reason to know that the act was committed without that other person's permission shall be guilty of rape. Okay, so this one, there's some really key things to keep in mind here. One is the action. So in the legal sector, with my legal hat on, there are different types of elements that we look to meet. There's mens rea, which is your mental, and then there's actus reus, which is the action, right? So when we're talking about the definition of rape in DC, and you're looking at that mens rea, which is your mind, your mental, the guilty mind. The question of whether you knew or should have known that the act that you were committing was without that person's permission is the fact that you have to prove the mens rea. Okay, keep a pin in that, because that's going to tie back to that mental capacity around the argument of insanity. Okay, so that mens rea says you knew or should have known that what you were doing without that person's permission. The actus rea says you also engage in an act or conduct with another person that was against their rights. So the actus rea is the actual action of having sex. The mens rea is doing it knowing that you're doing it without that person's permission. The two together have to be met in order for you to be guilty of what is defined as rape in DC. And so in this capacity, we're talking about, the argument that if it was in fact Maurice Kent that engaged in this sexual act, then we might have met the element. If it was in fact that Maurice Kent knew that what he was doing was allegedly without this person's permission, then the element of knew or should have known that you didn't have the person's permission would be met. However, it is hard to argue that if the insanity plea is recognized or accepted by the judge or the jury. So let's talk about that insanity plea in DC. In DC law, the insanity plea asserts that the person lacked culpability for a crime due to a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense. Keep in mind, it has to be at the time of the offense, not at the time of the trial. So you could have had a mental disease or defect on Tuesday, but if you go to trial on Wednesday and you're fine, doesn't matter. It's what happened at the time of the offense. And so that's what his attorney is arguing, is that he didn't have the culpability for the crime of robbery or the rape because at the time of the offense, he was insane. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how does he, get out of one and not the other? And we're going to talk about that in a second. But what I want you ultimately to keep in mind is that rape requires a mens rea and an actus rea. Robbery technically only requires the action, the actus reus. So he doesn't necessarily have to have an insane mind, in a sense, to still meet the elements of robbery, because it's about the physical conduct and not actually about what your mind also was doing. Okay, so Kent's lawyer presented this extensive evidence to support his defense of an insanity plea under the Durham plea at that time. He included expert testimony about Maurice Kent's mental condition, and so this is during a jury trial, because remember, he's in adult court. And so ultimately this led to Maurice Kent being acquitted of rape by reason of insanity. This ruling made Kent, under DC law, mandatory to be automatically transferred to St. Elizabeth Hospital until sanity was restored. On the other side, he was convicted of 6 counts of housebreaking and sentenced to 5 to 15 years on each count. So in a total, Maurice Kent was sentenced to 30 to 90 years in prison. At the age of 16, he was facing 30 to 90 years in prison. Okay. And so the biggest question that I know probably came up, like we just said, is how could he have been acquitted of the rape charge and found insane on the rape charges, but still maintain the robbery charges? And again, that's where that answer comes in around me explaining to you the different elements. He was acquitted of the rape charges because clearly the jury found him to be to meet the insanity plea of having a mental disease or defect, per all of the reports that had documented that he had a defect, per the affidavits of the school that stated he had a mental defect. And so he could not have had the mens rea to know or should have known that what he was doing was without permission because of the insanity. Remember, because rape needs men in actus. So even though he committed the act allegedly, the mental capacity was not present. In that same vessel under robbery, remember, reading the robbery definition to you all again, it says whoever by force or violence, whether against resistance or sudden stealther, seizure or stealthy snatching, puts fear. There's no need for a mens rea with robbery. It is all about the action. And so the insanity plea didn't save him from the robbery charges because the robbery charges doesn't require an element of mental awareness or capacity. It could be argued roughly, if you're arguing defense, that he wasn't fully aware, and those would be in those mitigating factors. But excuse me, as far as understanding the elements, it's alleged that he actually committed those elements of physical actus reus, and so the insanity plea doesn't cover that. And so, like I said, at this point, Maurice Kent is now facing 30 to 90 years in prison at the age of 16. And now it's time to talk about, the cognitive capacity of a typical versus atypical individual, especially an individual that is 16 years old. What does their cognitive ability look like at this age? What does that do when not only are we talking about cognitive development and ability, but we're also talking about a person who is reported to have mental health impairment? So at 16, the brain is expected to develop the ability to increase your problem solving skills and to have the capacity to consider multiple perspectives and put yourself in other people's shoes and abstract think, about possibilities and hypothetical situations. All of these things are important things to consequential thinking. These are things that a typical 16-year-old should have. However, if we're talking about the mental capacity of an individual whose report states, their psychological report states, they have a diagnosis of schizophrenic reaction, chronic, undifferentiated type. This is a bit different for them. The capacity to consequentially think and problem solve and to fully understand the severity of what they're doing and to talk themselves out of what they're doing is not present, or if it is present, is not functional in those sectors. And so schizophrenic reaction, chronic undifferentiated type, is pretty much undifferentiated schizophrenia. It's a subset of schizophrenia where a person has symptoms like disorganized thinking, hallucinations, they can have delusions, but it doesn't fully fit into that typical schizophrenia subtype. And so, it falls under this sector of like some of these things may be present and then some of them may not, but a lot of it, impacts that metacognitive area, especially that disorganized thinking. They have difficulties organizing their thoughts, which will then impact being able to functionally problem solve, which will in turn impact your ability to consequentially think, which in turn means that even though robbery doesn't have a mens rea, the impact of such a diagnosis will affect the decisions you make, whether they are cognitive or physical. So the physical decision to take something that does not belong to you means that you have to understand the severity of what you're doing, which, based on this diagnosis, Maurice Kent had some defects and deficits in that capacity. Okay, so I also want to unpack the cognitive capacity around the Miranda rights, because remember, we talked about the fact that Maurice Kent, there is no documentation that he actually was Mirandized at any point in these altogether 12 to 13 hours of interrogation. Mind you, being interrogated without an adult or legal counsel present. These are problematic things. And so we know from the research that Mirandizing youth is a very problematic thing, not only just because the vocabulary words tend to be very high level for the level of comprehension that a typically developing youth has, but if you're talking about an individual that has a history documented from his teachers of difficulty with academic success and academic progress, you're talking about a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which impacts metacognition and organizing information and processing information. You're talking about an individual that will have some impairments with that cognitive understanding of the Miranda rights. And so in addition to that, we have a lot of information around extensive interrogation of youth over hours and how that can increase coerced confessions and false confessions. And there's a large percentage of that. And so ultimately, when you do extensive interrogation on a youth without an adult or counsel present, it is supposed to have heightened scrutiny if that youth confesses to something, because there's a likelihood that, the youth is succumbing to pressure, or they could be succumbing to fatigue. They could be afraid. They have, what is known as this being custodial interrogation, where the youth has an understanding that they're not free to leave, but their mindset processes that if I tell them what they want to hear, maybe they'll let me leave. And so we have all of these things in place, in addition to the lack of understanding his rights. Because he was never Mirandized, we don't even know if he knew what his rights was. And again, remember, this is very early 1960s when Black people were just getting all of the rights that we were entitled to. So being aware of those rights inherently should not be expected. We also have vulnerability, because youth are the most vulnerable population as compared to adults in these spaces. Then tack on the part of the cognitive capacity and the diagnosis of a mental health impairment, and vulnerability drops that much lower. We also have the lack of parental involvement and the lack of counsel attorney involvement. And so there was nobody there to make sure that his rights were protected when he so-called allegedly confessed to being involved in these cases. And so ultimately, the court's decision led to Kent's attorney appealing. And so there was multiple arguments that Kent's attorney made in his appeal. And, one of the biggest things that he argued follows many factors. And so we're going to go through a few of the arguments so that we can unpack what this appeal started to look like. And so first, he appealed that the juvenile court judge, never ruled on the original motions I told you he submitted. Remember, I told you he submitted the motion with the affidavits from the parents, the teachers, the psychologists, all of that. The appeal also argued that the juvenile court judge never held a hearing, and that he didn't confer with the petitioner, which would be Maurice Kent or Maurice Kent's parents, or him as the attorney. So he argued that the juvenile court judge just entered an order reciting that they had done a full investigation, but that no full investigation was actually done, that the judge made no findings, and that he did not recite a reason for the waiver, and that he made no reference to the motions that Kent's attorney had filed. And so his attorney states, we must assume that he denied sub silentio, meaning no sound, sight or sound, the motions for a hearing, the recommendation for hospitalization for psychiatric observation, the request for access to the social service file, and the offer to prove that the petitioner was a fit subject for rehabilitation under the juvenile court's jurisdiction. And so because the judge didn't do all of those things, this decision of him being in adult court, number one, is invalid, and this sentence of 30 to 90 years is absurd, erroneous, and invalid, and we want to appeal it. His attorney also discusses, that there was a number of grounds for reversal of this sentence and this waiver. He argued that Kent's detention and the interrogation was at minimum unlawful, that the police failed to follow the procedures prescribed by the Juvenile Court Act. And in that Juvenile Court Act, the expectation is that when a child is interrogated by law enforcement, they must notify the parents of the child, and the juvenile court itself must be notified. And so because of that, the attorney argues that Morris Kent was deprived of his liberty for about a week without a determination of probable cause, which would have been required in an adult case. In that argument, what he's ultimately saying is when adults are when adults are arrested and sentenced or held before a trial, they have the right to a speedy trial, meaning immediately stuff's supposed to happen. And if Morris Kent, even though he was 16, is being tried as an adult, then he also has the right to a speedy trial. But he was not given that right. Even though he was being tried as an adult, he was still being treated like he was a juvenile held in a juvenile court. And so in the vessel of him being interrogated by police in the absence of counsel or parent, Morris Kent's attorney also argued that Morris Kent was not warned of his rights to remain silent or advice as to his right to counsel, which is also required in the Juvenile Court Act, and that this was a violation of his rights would he have been an adult. Because again, remember, as an adult, you must be Mirandized. As an adult, you must know what your rights are. As an adult, you must be allowed to have an attorney present if you ask for one. However, remember in 1961, prior to this Hallmark case, juveniles didn't have those rights. And so what his attorney is arguing is that even though juveniles weren't getting those rights because they were juveniles, you were trying my client as an adult. So these were his rights and he did not get them in. You violated his rights. Would he have been an adult? And even if he wasn't an adult, these are things that the Juvenile Court Act says should have been done. And so it raised a lot of issues around the construction and compliance with the Juvenile Court Act. Was the juvenile courts in DC following the Juvenile Court Act? Was the justifiability of giving a juvenile less protection than an adult gets right? This is what he's arguing. And so, he wanted to know, like, what's good with this? What are we going to do? We need to argue this because there's so many violations and we can't overlook these violations and things need to change in this process. And so he filed this appeal. The appeal went all the way up. It went up to the Supreme Court. And in that process of going up to the Supreme Court, there was arguments back and forth. And what the Supreme Court ultimately said is, it is clear beyond dispute that the waiver of jurisdiction is a critically important action determining vitally important statutory rights of the juvenile. The Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia violated those rights, pretty much. It also stated that per the Juvenile Court Act, there are certain special rights and immunities. And so, by statute, Morris Kent was allowed to be confined, but there were exceptions to his confinement. One of those exceptions was he was not to be jailed along with adults. He may be detained, but only until he's 21 years of age. And so the court gives this statute preference to retaining children in the custody of their parents unless the welfare and safety of the public cannot be safeguarded. And so it's supposed to protect a child from adult conviction consequences and losing their civil rights if it's not absolutely necessary. Okay. So the Supreme Court held that at the time Morris Kent was 16, and per the statute, he was entitled to certain procedures and benefits as a consequence of his statutory right to the exclusive jurisdiction of the juvenile court. And so ultimately they are saying that in those circumstances, that even in considering that the juvenile court decided to waive their jurisdiction and transfer it to a district court, a condition to a valid waiver is that Morris Kent was entitled to a hearing. His counsel was entitled to see the social records and the probation records and any reports that the court had access to. And that Morris Kent was also entitled to a statement of reasons for why the juvenile court decided to waive their jurisdiction to the adult court. And because they did not do those things, that they absolutely violated his rights, and that there needed to be things that had to be done to change that. The Supreme Court argued that all of the social records concerning Morris Kent that were relevant to the waiver that the juvenile court used must be deemed to consider the entire history of the child in determining the waiver. And since Morris Kent's attorney had no knowledge of what the social records contained, he couldn't be expected to demonstrate the relevance of the importance of those items in his request, which made his counsel ineffective, like he originally argued. Going back to those social records, I want to talk to my clinicians. Note how in this Hallmark case, the social records is a key part to this whole argument. And in those social records, like I said, academic records are major, especially when you're talking about a youth that is in the limbo of being kept in the jurisdiction of juvenile court or tried as an adult. It's really, really, really important that what you put in those academic records, in your legal documents of your evaluations, your evaluation reports, your progress notes, the IEP, your meeting notes, that all of it is true and accurate and supportive and clear cut to the understanding of the needs that the child has. They should be devoid of your bias and of your stereotype, because they make major factors and decisions to how a defense can argue, how a juvenile court may decide, how prosecution may stand on it. All of those things were major parts to the decisions that were made about Morris Kent. So keeping those things in mind, ultimately, Morris Kent's attorney is winning this argument because the Supreme Court found that, Morris Kent's attorney should have been advised of the information that the juvenile court relied on, including those social records, in their determination of waiving. And that by them not providing him with that information, a full investigation wasn't actually done. And so, for the reasons stated, the Supreme Court held that the Court of Appeals and the DC District Court erred on sustaining the validity of the waiver by the juvenile court, ultimately saying that the waiver by the juvenile court was not valid. And so they ultimately ruled that the court should vacate the judgment. And since at the time of The decision, Kent was past the age of 16 and the juvenile court couldn't exercise jurisdiction over him any longer. The convictions had to be vacated and the indictment dismissed. And so they also argued that the statements that he made during interrogation, because he was not Mirandized and because technically he was a juvenile at the time that they were provided, were inadmissible in any criminal prosecution. So even if, because they vacated and dismissed the conviction and things, even if prosecution decided we're going to pick this back up and retrial it, their evidence and things are weaker because they cannot admit his confessions because the Supreme Court ruled them out as being inadmissible. And so in that process, Morris Kent was released in early 1968 after serving about 7 or so years in confinement and in prison. And the precedent was set that under the Juvenile Court Act, the Kent case set the precedent for juvenile due process. Ultimately, what it says is that juveniles are entitled to the same amount of due process as adults. That includes, a thorough investigation of cases before waiving cases to adult courts, the importance of, jurisdiction waivers and the importance of social factors, and making sure that a juvenile is receiving effective counsel, that their counsel receives everything that they have, that they have a right to speedy trials, that they have a right to have an understanding of why the case is being waived, that an actual thorough investigation is done, and that all records that are reviewed are also made available to the counsel of that youth. This was a major case. It made a big difference from 1960 when the Supreme Court made the decision to today. And so it means that what you put in your records as a clinician and what you write in your reports as educators and tutors and wraparound services is important, because those social factors are weighed into when juvenile courts are making the decision of waiving their jurisdiction to the adult court or not. So at this time, Mr. Morris Kent ended up getting married. He had children, and there's never been any documentation of him ever having any involvement with the law again, which goes to show that kids can change if in fact they did have some type of involvement with the alleged crime or charges that they're being placed in. It does go to show that with support and wraparound services and advocacy, that things can be made a difference, and that sometimes the worst mistake that a child has ever had or made is not the end of their life, and that rehabilitation could be possible. But the only way to know if rehabilitation and cognitive capacity is present or impaired or impacted is to, one, include the input of the clinicians and the educators, but two, to also consider the documents and the factors that align to their ability and their prognosis for rehabilitation. It also means, like I said, clinicians and educators, that the reports and the documentation that you're writing is always written from the utmost place of ethics and morals, and understanding of the role you took to be a clinician or educator. Because, like we said, one, clinicians, your documents are always legal documents, and two, you never know when or where or how what you have written about a child may be used, considered, or activated. And this is a prime example of a Hallmark case that has made a vast difference in the lives of youth moving forward from 1966 to today, that included a big hang up on mental capacity, cognitive capacity, and social factors of academic records. And that is part 1 of season 3, episode 1. Stay tuned next week for part 2, where we'll talk about the Henry Galt case. This is dope. I'm happy to be back. Let's chat. See you next week.